Some promises are made with love. Others are made out of guilt. But the hardest to carry are the ones that are forgotten. By everyone but you. 30 years of toil to raise her children, 13 in total, each held in the arms of a mother who gave them everything. They once promised her, "We will never leave you alone." But at 83, Margaret Maggie Sullivan is left with nothing but those faded promises, and a silence that echoes louder with each passing day. If you've ever been hurt by family, leave a 5 so she knows she's not the only one. Before we start, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Try to watch the videos as long as possible. By watching more often, YouTube will promote these stories to a larger audience, grow your channel, and bring you more interesting things. Let's start now. Every morning, she sits on the porch of her old farmhouse in Millfield, eyes fixed on the dusty road, hoping for a familiar face, for a return that her heart still believes in, though her mind tells her it may never come. But Maggie's story isn't just about loneliness. Hidden behind the quiet creaks of her wooden porch is a secret, a truth buried so deep it's never been spoken aloud. And once it's revealed, nothing will be the same. Millfield, with its slow sunrises and unchanging rhythm, wakes beneath a warm, golden haze. At the end of a winding red dirt road, where roosters crow and the wind hums gently across open fields, Maggie rocks gently in her old chair, one that once held her children when they couldn't sleep. She doesn't hear the market opening, doesn't smell the bread baking at the cafe nearby. Her thoughts drift backward to years filled with noise, laughter, bare feet pounding on wooden floors, voices calling Mama from every room. Now, silence is her only company. That and the 6 old cats curled at her feet, creatures that, unlike her children, never left. Her fingers, worn and trembling, clutch the old apron on her lap. She reaches into the pocket. There it is, always the same. A letter, yellowed with age, faded words. But she doesn't need to read it. She knows every word. She closes her eyes. "Alexander," she whispers. A breeze snatches the letter, tossing it to the ground. She leans down, slowly, painfully, but before she can reach it, a shadow falls over the paper. When she looks up, she meets the gaze of someone unexpected, Matthew Johnson, a 22-year-old clerk from Thompson's General Store. He doesn't speak right away, but his eyes say enough. He's been watching, noticing how she buys less and less each week. First the meat, then the rice, then the oil, the last time, just beans. He gently picks up the letter and hands it to her. "Good morning, Mrs. Sullivan," he says quietly. She hesitates, then meets his eyes with her faded, honey-colored gaze. "Good morning, Matt," she replies. He shouldn't ask, but something inside him won't let it go. "Excuse me if I'm being nosy, but are you waiting for someone?" She lets out a soft, bitter laugh. "All my life, I've been waiting for someone, son," she says. "But some waits last longer than they should." Matt swallows hard. He glances toward the house. The roof is cracked, the backyard overgrown, the walls leaning in silence. "And your children?" he asks. Her face doesn't change. Her voice is steady. I don't know. I haven't seen them in many years. 13 children. And not a single one had returned. That evening, Matt walks home unable to shake the image of Maggie sitting alone, looking out at a road that never brings anyone back. This isn't right, he whispers. And that night, he makes a decision that will change both of their lives forever, as if she's waiting for something or someone. Matt fell silent. There was something about all this that didn't add up to him. For the rest of the day, he tried to concentrate on his work, but Julian's words kept going around in his head. He thought of his own mother, how she always told him that all she asked of him was that he never forget her. How was it possible that 13 children had forgotten the woman who gave them life? When evening fell, and the sun began to tint the sky with orange tones, Matt made a decision. He waited for the store to close, and instead of going straight home, he took the dirt road that led to Maggie's house. When he arrived, he found her in the same way as always, sitting in her wooden chair with her eyes fixed on the horizon. This time, however, she wasn't alone. A tabby cat slept at her feet, and another curled up in her lap as she gently stroked its back. Matt cleared his throat to get her attention. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Sullivan." She turned her head slowly, as if it cost her to return to the present. "Ah, Matt, I didn't expect to see you so soon." The young man approached, feeling a little uncomfortable. "I was passing by and thought I'd say hello." The old woman observed him with a slight smile. "You don't have to make excuses, son. I know you have questions." Matt felt caught. "I don't want to be intrusive, but I find it hard to understand how someone can forget their own mother." Maggie sighed and looked toward the street. "Life is like that, son. When children grow up, they find their own way, and mothers are left waiting. But they don't look for you. They don't even write to you." She shook her head. "It's been years since I've heard anything from them. I don't know if they're well, if they have families, if they're still alive." Matt felt a chill upon hearing those words. "Yesterday, I saw you with a letter." The old woman looked down. "That letter is all I have left from them." "Who sent it to you?" Maggie remained silent for a moment. Then, with a barely audible whisper, she said, "Alexander." The young man frowned. "The oldest?" She nodded. "He sent it to me years ago. In it, he promised he would return soon, that he would take me with him so I wouldn't suffer hardship." Matt waited a moment before asking, "And why haven't you opened it?" Maggie pressed her lips together. "Because if I open it, it means I have nothing left to wait for." The young man felt something break inside him. "But Mrs. Sullivan, what if that letter contained something important?" She smiled sadly. "If it were important, something would have happened by now, don't you think?" Matt didn't know how to respond. The silence between them lengthened, interrupted only by the distant song of crickets. The young man looked at the house once more. The roof was deteriorated, the walls cracked, the door with rusty hinges. Everything in that place spoke of abandonment, but what hurt him most was the resigned expression on the old woman's face. It wasn't fair. Before saying goodbye, he made a decision. "I'm going to help you, Mrs. Sullivan." She looked at him with surprise. "I don't need help, son." Matt shook his head. "I don't just mean with groceries. There are things here that need fixing. Also, if you don't want to read that letter, at least let me keep you company." The old woman looked at him for a long time, as if evaluating him. Finally, she sighed. "If you insist on helping me, I won't stop you, but don't expect me to tell you happy stories." Matt smiled. "Sometimes sad stories are the most important ones." Maggie didn't respond, but for the first time in a long time, the feeling of being completely alone vanished, if only a little. Matt left that night with a firm determination inside. He would not allow that woman to die in oblivion. What he didn't know was that in doing so, he was about to discover something that would change not only Maggie's life, but also his own. Matt couldn't stop thinking about Maggie all night. He tossed and turned in bed with the image of the old woman holding that yellowed letter in her hands. He couldn't accept that someone who had given everything for her children would end up that way, alone in a house that was falling apart, with the only consolation of an old paper she refused to open. When the sun began to filter through his bedroom window, his decision was clear. He couldn't fix Maggie's past, but he could do something about her present. He left home early and went straight to Thompson's General Store. Upon arrival, he greeted Julian with a slight nod and immediately headed to the back of the store. He searched among the bags of beans, rice, and flour until he gathered a small bag of provisions. When he was ready, Julian approached him with his arms crossed. "And that food, don't tell me you're taking it without paying." Matt felt caught and lowered his gaze. "It's for Mrs. Sullivan." The man narrowed his eyes and sighed heavily. "That poor woman. I don't know how she keeps going." Julian didn't say more. He walked to the counter, took some bills from his pocket, and placed them on the table. "Consider this a small gift from the store." Matt looked at him with surprise. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson." The man just nodded and returned to his work. With the bag in hand, Matt left the store and took the path to Maggie's house. When he arrived, he found her again at the entrance, with her eyes lost on the empty street. The sunlight made her silver hair look even whiter, and the thin shawl covering her shoulders moved with the wind. He stopped for a moment before speaking. "Good morning, Mrs. Sullivan?" The old woman blinked and turned toward him. "Matt, I didn't expect to see you so early." The young man raised the bag of provisions. "I brought you some food." The woman's lips tightened into a fine line. "I don't need charity, son." "It's not charity," Matt insisted. "It's just a gift." Maggie hesitated for a moment, but seeing the sincere look in the boy's eyes, she sighed with resignation. "All right, come in." Matt crossed the entrance and looked around. The interior of the house was even sadder than he had imagined. The walls were bare, without paint, and the floor had cracks in several places. A wooden table with 2 chairs occupied the center of the kitchen, and on it, a candle burned halfway down. The only sounds in the house came from the cats that moved among the furniture. "Sit down, son," said the old woman, as she took out 2 clay mugs and filled them with black coffee. Matt obeyed and left the bag on the table. "Mrs. Sullivan, how many years have you been living here alone?" She took a sip of coffee before answering. "Too many. I've lost count." "And you've never thought about leaving town?" The old woman let out a laugh without humor. "To go where?" "Matt." Matt didn't know what to answer. "I had hopes that my children would come for me." She continued, her gaze fixed on the dark liquid in her cup. "But time passed, and I understood that no one would come. The young man felt a knot in his throat. It's not fair. Maggie looked at him with a slight smile. Life is never fair, son. There was a long silence between the two. Matt looked at the wrinkles on the old woman's hands, the scars on her fingers that spoke of years of hard work. Tell me something. Mrs. Sullivan? Why don't you want to read that letter? The woman's eyes hardened immediately. Because if I read it, it means there's nothing left to wait for. Matt felt the weight of those words. He didn't insist further. He stayed with her for a while, sharing coffee in silence. Oh, yeah. Before leaving, he helped sweep the entrance and promised to return the next day with more food. That night, as he lay in his bed, he knew there was no turning back. He had made the decision to help Maggie. What he didn't imagine was that in doing so, he was about to discover a secret that would change his life forever. Matt returned to Maggie's house the next day with a strange feeling in his chest. Something about the old woman troubled him, as if in her gaze there was a much larger story than she was willing to tell. When he arrived, he found her in the same position as always, sitting at the entrance to her house with a cat on her lap and her gaze lost in the road. But this time, her expression was different. There wasn't just sadness in her face, but something more, something akin to fear. Good morning, Mrs. Sullivan, he greeted cautiously. The old woman blinked a couple of times and looked up at him. Ah, Matt, I didn't see you coming. He noticed her voice sounded hoarser than usual. Are you all right? She remained silent for a few seconds before answering. I slept poorly, she said simply. Matt sat on the step next to her, resting his elbows on his knees. Yesterday you told me you had 13 children. Maggie let out a slight sigh. That's right. 13 children. 13 reasons not to feel alone. But in the end, here I am. Matt felt a knot in his throat. Tell me about them. The old woman shifted in her chair and stroked the cat with slow movements. Alexander was the oldest. She began. He was always the most serious, the most responsible. He said that when he grew up, he would get me out of here, that he would take me to live with him. She paused as if it hurt to remember. But when he left, he never came back. Matt frowned. Never, Maggie shook her head. Just that letter he sent me, the one I still don't dare to read. The young man felt anger burning in his chest. That's not right. The old woman smiled bitterly. That's life. Matt, you raise your children with love, give them everything you have, and then when they grow up, they leave without looking back. Matt clenched his fists. Not all children are like that. Maggie looked at him with tenderness. No, son, not all, but mine were. There was a long silence between the two. Matt felt the need to know more. And the others? The old woman looked down. Stephen was the dreamer. He always said he wanted to be a lawyer, that he would defend poor people. He went to Boston to study, but once there, he stopped writing to me. Matt felt something in his chest tighten. Not a call, not a visit. Maggie shook her head. Nothing. The young man swallowed, and Lucy. The old woman's face tensed. Lucy Matt waited, but Maggie said nothing more. What happened with her? The old woman closed her eyes for a moment, then rose with difficulty. Son, it's late. I must prepare dinner. Matt understood that the conversation was over, but he wasn't leaving without answers. Mrs. Sullivan, I want to help you. The old woman stopped and looked at him with infinite sadness. No one can help me, Matt. He stood up decisively. Let me try. She sighed, and for the first time in years, felt that someone really cared about her. What neither of them knew was that by opening that door, they were about to unearth a past that had remained buried for too long. Matt walked back home with a heavy heart. What Maggie had told him weighed on his mind like a stone. 13 children. 13 people who at some point called her mom, and who now were nothing more than shadows in her memory. That night, as he ate dinner at the wooden table in his house, his mother, Carrie Johnson, noticed his distraction. Is something wrong? Son, since you arrived, you've been quiet. Matt put the spoon down on his plate and sighed. Today I talked with Mrs. Sullivan. Carrie crossed her arms and rested her elbows on the table. Poor woman, always alone with those cats. Matt looked at her seriously. Mom, she has 13 children. Carrie blinked in surprise. 13, repeated Matt. And none of them come to see her. His mother's face darkened. What an injustice. Matt nodded, and without thinking too much, told her everything he had discovered in the past few days. He told her about Alexander, the oldest son who promised to return and never did, about Stephen, the dreamer who went off to study and disappeared, about Lucy, the daughter who got married and never returned. When he finished, Carrie had her eyes full of indignation. That's not right. Matt, it's not right that a mother who gave everything for her children ends up like this. He ran a hand through his hair and nodded. We can't make her children come back, but I think we can do something for her. Make her life a little easier by bringing her food, fixing things in her house. I don't know. Anything that helps. His mother remained silent for a moment, as if evaluating the idea. Then she sighed. I'm going to talk to some women in town. See if we can do something. Matt felt a small relief. It was a step in the right direction. The next morning, Carrie talked to some of her neighbors, and the story of Maggie began to spread through the town. People had always seen her as a solitary old woman, but now they knew the truth. One of the first to react was Ellen Baker, the baker's wife. I can bring her bread in the mornings, she said. I always have extra pieces. Julian Thompson, the owner of the general store where Matt worked, also joined in. If she needs beans, rice, or sugar, I can help. Even the town's priest, a gray-haired man with a measured voice, became interested in the situation. I'm going to visit her. Maybe she wants to talk to someone. Matt couldn't believe how quickly people were reacting. That afternoon, when he arrived at Maggie's house with a sack of cornmeal and some vegetables, he found her with an expression of surprise as she saw Carrie and Ellen at her door. We've come to help you, Mrs. Sullivan, said Carrie softly. The old woman looked at Matt with suspicion. You did this? He smiled with a slight shrug. You told me no one could help you. I wanted to prove you wrong, for the first time in a long time. Maggie felt that her house wasn't empty. But while the town began to care for her, far away, someone was about to see her face for the first time in many years. And what would come next would change everything. The sun was setting over Millfield when Maggie went out to the entrance of her house. The last few days had been different. Strange in her silent daily routine. People who had never stopped before now brought her bread, offered her food, or simply greeted her with a smile. She didn't know what to think about it. She looked at Matt, who was finishing, sweeping the entrance. He moved with ease, as if he had always been there. But she wasn't used to depending on anyone. Not after so many years of solitude. "You don't need to do that, son," she said in a tired voice. Matt leaned the broom against the wall and looked at her with a slight smile. "I do it because I want to. Mrs. Sullivan?" She narrowed her eyes, studying him with that gaze that seemed to pierce the soul. "Why do you care so much about an old woman like me?" Matt shrugged. "Because no one should be alone." Maggie looked away. She wanted to believe his words, but life had taught her otherwise. From across the street, a neighbor observed the scene with discretion. Her name was Laura Mitchell, and she had always felt curious about the old woman who lived alone with her cats. She had heard rumors about her children, about how they had abandoned her, but seeing her now, so fragile and quiet, generated a feeling of injustice. She took her phone from her pocket and, without thinking too much, took a photo of Maggie sitting at the door with Matt by her side. It was a sad and beautiful image at the same time. That night, when Laura checked her phone, she decided to write a message along with the photo. "This is Maggie Sullivan. She raised 13 children alone, gave them everything. Today, none of them are here. How many mothers live in oblivion while their children go on with their lives? Let's never forget where we come from." She posted it on her Facebook account and turned off the phone. She didn't think much about it, but social media is unpredictable. The next morning, when she woke up, she saw that her post had hundreds of shares, and someone in a distant place was about to see that image. In Chicago. Alexander checked his phone as he did every morning before going to work. He slid his finger across the screen without much interest, until an image caught his attention. Time seemed to stop when he looked at it. It was an elderly woman, with white hair, sitting at the entrance of a humble house. She had a lost gaze, as if waiting for someone who would never come. His stomach contracted. His heart began to beat faster. There was no doubt. It was his mother. He remained motionless, reading the message that accompanied the photo. He felt a chill run down his spine. It was as if someone had stabbed him in the chest. The air in the room became heavy. His mother, the woman who had raised him, who had worked until she was worn out for him and his siblings, was alone, and he, for years, had pretended she didn't exist. Alexander felt the world closing in on him. He took the phone with trembling hands and dialed a number he hadn't used in a long time. What would happen next would change his life forever. Alexander held the phone in his hands, unable to press the call button. It had been over 20 years since he had last heard his mother's voice. Now, after seeing her in that photo, with her face marked by the years and sadness, all the weight of his abandonment fell on him like an unbearable burden. He let out a trembling sigh and ran his hand over his face. He was in his office in Chicago, surrounded by documents, numbers, and pending calls. But for the first time in a long time, none of that mattered to him. He could only think of his mother, of that broken promise to return for her. He dialed the number with trembling fingers, but before the first tone sounded, he hung up. He couldn't do it. He got up from his chair and began to walk around the office, trying to order his thoughts. He needed to talk to someone. He took the phone again and looked for another contact in his list. "Hello?" The voice on the other end of the line sounded sleepy. "Stephen? It's me. Alexander?" There was a long silence. "Alexander." His brother's voice became alert. "What's going on?" Alexander swallowed. "It's Mom." From the other side came the sound of a tired sigh. "I don't know what to tell you. Neither do I." Another uncomfortable silence settled between them. Neither of the two had mentioned their mother in years. It was like a tacit agreement, as if by ignoring her, they could avoid the guilt. Alexander cleared his throat and rubbed his forehead. "Today, I saw a photo of her on the internet. Someone posted it on Facebook. She's at the door of her house, alone. She looks..." He paused, feeling a knot in his throat. "She looks like she's waiting for someone who never comes." Stephen didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice sounded strangely contained. "How do you know it's recent?" "Because people from the town are helping her. I don't know exactly what's happened, but someone is taking care of her. Someone who isn't us." Stephen let out a bitter laugh. "Someone with more heart than us. Then, we have to go see her." "After so many years, do you think she'll want to see us?" "I don't know," admitted Alexander, "but we have to do it." There was a long silence. Stephen seemed to hesitate, but in the end, he let out a heavy sigh. "If you go, I'll go." Alexander nodded, though his brother couldn't see him. "We leave tomorrow." When he hung up, he felt the air in his office become a little lighter, but he wasn't fooling himself. The real weight was yet to come, on the other side of the country, in Millfield. Maggie continued in her wooden chair with her gaze fixed on the road. She didn't know it yet, but her children were about to return. And when they did, nothing would ever be the same again. The journey from Chicago to Millfield was long and silent. Alexander drove with his gaze fixed on the highway, his knuckles tense on the steering wheel, while Stephen, seated in the passenger seat, distractedly observed the arid landscape that extended around them. The hours passed, and neither said anything. What could be said after so many years of absence? Stephen played with his phone for a moment before letting out a heavy sigh. "What are we going to say to her?" "Alex." Alexander gripped the wheel tighter. "I don't know." Stephen ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "What if she doesn't want to see us?" Alexander swallowed. That possibility was real, and it tormented him. I wouldn't blame her. The silence between them lengthened. The truth was that neither of them was prepared to face what was coming. For years, they had buried their guilt under excuses and work. They convinced themselves that their absence was natural, that their own lives were too busy to stop in the past. But the past had caught up with them. After several hours of travel, the dirt road that led to the town appeared before them. Alexander felt his heart beating strongly in his chest. Everything was the same. The same adobe houses, the same central square with its small church, the same children running barefoot through the dusty streets. Nothing had changed except them. When they reached the entrance to the town, Alexander slowed the car and looked at his brother. "If you want us to turn around, this is the moment." Stephen let out a laugh without humor. and live with the guilt for another 20 years. No, thanks. Alexander nodded and continued driving. As they approached their mother's house, his breathing became heavier. He had no idea what to expect. Finally, they turned at the last corner, and the house appeared before them. There it was, the same old house with its rusty roof shingles and cracked walls. At the entrance, seated in the same wooden chair as always, was her Maggie Sullivan. The old woman had a vacant stare on the road, with her hands crossed on her lap. She didn't seem to notice the arrival of the car. Alexander turned off the engine and swallowed. It's now or never. Stephen nodded, but neither of them moved. They didn't know how to take that first step. Finally, Alexander opened the door and got out of the car. His heart was beating so hard he could feel it in his ears. Stephen followed him, more tense than ever. They walked towards the house with slow steps, as if each one weighed a ton, when they were just a few meters from the entrance. Maggie looked up. Her gaze met Alexander's. Time seemed to stop. Alexander felt a knot in his throat. It had been more than 20 years since the last time he saw her. His mother's face was furrowed with wrinkles. Her skin seemed more fragile. But her eyes, sure eyes, were still the same eyes that looked at him with a mixture of surprise and something else. Something Alexander couldn't decipher. No one said anything. The wind blew, raising dust on the street. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Maggie spoke. I knew you would come back someday. Her voice was low, serene, with no trace of anger, no tears, no reproaches. That was what hurt the most. Alexander felt a shiver run through him. He expected shouting, expected demands, expected fury, but his mother just looked at them as if she had never stopped waiting for them. Stephen looked down at the ground, unable to meet her gaze. Alexander opened his mouth to speak, but found no words. Maggie observed them for a moment more before doing something that took them completely by surprise. She got up from her chair and simply said, Come in. Turning to enter the house, Alexander and Stephen remained in place, motionless. They hadn't expected it to be so easy, but when they crossed the door behind her, Alexander had the feeling that, although she had let them in, forgiving them would be another story. Alexander and Stephen entered the house with cautious steps, as if they were treading on unfamiliar ground, and in a way, they were. The house where they grew up. The one that was once the refuge of their childhood, now seemed foreign to them. The walls, once decorated with drawings and photographs, were bare and cracked. The roof had sunken parts, and the air smelled of moisture, of time standing still, of abandonment. The silence inside the house was overwhelming. Maggie walked slowly to the wooden table that still stood in the kitchen. She sat down with the same serenity with which she had received them, showing no surprise, no tears, no anger. The two men remained standing at the threshold of the door, uncomfortable, not knowing what to do or say. There was no script for that moment. Finally, Alexander took a deep breath and stepped forward. Mom. The word came out of his mouth with difficulty. It was the first time in decades that he had pronounced it. Maggie looked up and observed him calmly. Sit down. It was an order rather than an invitation. Alexander and Stephen looked at each other before obeying. They sat across from their mother with their hands clasped on their knees. The ticking of an old wall clock was the only thing that broke the silence. Maggie took the earthenware teapot she had on the table and began to serve coffee in 3 uneven cups. "I didn't expect you to come back," she finally said. Alexander felt a weight fall on his shoulders. The words got caught in his throat. Maggie raised her gaze and held it with an unsettling calm. "Tell me the truth. Alexander, why are you here?" Alexander felt trapped. He had rehearsed so many times what he was going to say, but at that moment, no excuse sounded sufficient. "I saw the photo," he confessed, lowering his gaze. "The one someone uploaded to Facebook?" Stephen let out a slight sigh and added in a low voice, "We didn't know you were like this." Maggie let out a soft laugh without humor. "You didn't know, or you preferred not to know." Silence settled in the room again. Alexander felt his chest tighten. "Mom, But Maggie raised a hand, stopping him. "Don't call me that. You don't deserve it yet." Her words were a blow stronger than any shout. Stephen looked away, feeling as small as a scolded child. "We haven't been good sons," he finally admitted. "No," Maggie responded with a firm voice. "You haven't been." Alexander swallowed. "But we want to make amends." The old woman looked at them in silence for several seconds, as if deciding whether it was worth believing them. "And how do you plan to do that?" she finally asked. Alexander felt a shiver run down his spine. He had no answer for that. Before he could say anything, a voice interrupted the tense conversation. "Everything okay here?" The three turned toward the door. Matt was there, leaning on the frame with his arms crossed. His presence in Maggie's house, his protective tone, made it evident that he had occupied the space that Alexander and Stephen had left vacant for years. The young man walked to the table with a firm step and looked at the two men with attention. "I'm Matt," he said. "I've been helping Mrs. Sullivan." Alexander narrowed his eyes. "Helping? How taking care of her?" Matt responded, without beating around the bush. "Doing what you should have done." The words hit hard. Maggie observed the scene in silence, without intervening. Alexander felt a knot in his throat. He didn't expect to find another man in his mother's life, much less someone so young and with such a firm gaze. "We don't need you to tell us what we should have done," Alexander responded in a tense voice. Matt looked at him calmly, without being upset. "Oh no." "Because it seems that if it weren't for that photo, you would never have come back." Stephen looked down at the floor. Alexander clenched his jaw. "We didn't come to argue. Then what did you come for?" Alexander felt his patience running out. "It's a family matter." Matt let out an ironic laugh. "Family? How curious." "Because in all these months, I haven't seen any family here." Alexander felt the heat rising to his face. "Listen, kid," Matt interrupted him, crossing his arms. "The one who has to listen is you." He leaned slightly over the table, looking him in the eyes. "Mrs. Sullivan has lived alone for years. She had no one to bring her food, to fix her house, to accompany her when she got sick. No one." Alexander felt a shiver run down his spine. "You're right," he finally said. Matt raised an eyebrow, surprised by the response. "We've been ungrateful," continued Alexander. "We know that, and we don't expect you to forgive us immediately." Stephen finally raised his gaze and added with a sincere voice, "But we want to do things right this time." Matt remained silent, observing them carefully. Finally, he let out a sigh and took a step back. "It's not me you have to convince." Everyone turned to look at Maggie. The old woman observed the three of them as if analyzing them. "Finally," she sighed and got up from her chair. "I'm tired. Let's leave this conversation for tomorrow." Alexander and Stephen nodded slowly. "Can we stay here tonight?" Alexander asked cautiously. Maggie looked at him for a moment before answering. "If you want." Then she turned and disappeared down the hallway, leaving them in the living room with discomfort hanging in the air. Matt looked at them one last time before shaking his head and leaving the house without saying another word. Alexander and Stephen remained there, at the same table where they once were happy children. But now, in that house full of memories and uncomfortable silences, they knew that their return was just the beginning of something much more difficult. The house was in shadows when Alexander and Stephen were left alone in the kitchen. The old bulb on the ceiling flickered with a dim light, projecting shadows on the worn walls. Outside, the night wind blew forcefully, making the roof shingles creak. There weren't enough words to describe the discomfort both felt. They didn't expect a warm reception, but neither did they expect that abyss of distance that separated them from their mother. Alexander rested his elbows on the table, rubbing his temples with both hands. This was worse than I imagined. Stephen, who had remained silent since Maggie left them there, let out a tired sigh. "Did you expect her to hug us and tell us everything is fine?" Alexander raised his head and looked at him with frustration. "No, but I expected something more than this. Like what Stephen narrowed his eyes. That she wouldn't throw in our faces what we did. That she would forgive us on the first day." Alexander remained quiet. "I don't know if you noticed, but there's no rage in her voice," continued Stephen. "No reproaches, just resignation. And that's worse." Alexander knew it. If his mother had received them with anger, with shouts or demands, it would be easier to bear. But that silent calm, that distance between them, meant that she had learned to live without them. The back door opened suddenly, and Matt entered without asking permission. He wore a light sweater, and his hair still had traces of moisture, as if he had washed his face before returning. "Still here?" he asked ironically. Stephen let out a sarcastic laugh. "Of course. Where else are we supposed to be?" Matt closed the door calmly and approached the sink, opening the tap to fill a glass with water. He drank slowly before turning to look at them. "You'll sleep in the back room." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "You decide that too?" Matt smiled wryly. "It's not about deciding, but your mother didn't offer you a room, so I guess she wasn't expecting you to stay." Alexander clenched his jaw, but didn't respond. "The back room is empty," continued Matt. "There's only a mattress and some old blankets. If you don't like it, you can look for a hotel in town." Stephen snorted, but got up from the chair. "Thanks for the hospitality." Matt looked at him with a neutral expression. "I'm not doing it for you." Alexander also stood up, feeling the weight of the conversation on his shoulders. "If you're so upset with our presence, why are you still here?" Matt smiled mockingly. "Because I am here for her." Alexander felt something inside him break. That young man was making it clear what they didn't want to admit. He had occupied the place they abandoned. Without saying anything more, Alexander took his suitcase and left the kitchen along with Stephen. The back room was almost empty. A worn mattress on the floor, an old wooden table in the corner, and a small window through which the moonlight entered. "Looks like someone has already taken our place," murmured Stephen bitterly as he threw his suitcase on the floor. Alexander didn't respond. He dropped onto the mattress and looked at the ceiling. They had returned after so many years intending to fix things. But what if it was already too late that night? Neither of them could sleep. The ghosts of the past were still there, lurking. Alexander and Stephen tried to sleep, but sleep never fully came. The weight of the years of absence, the cold reception from their mother, and Matt's defiant presence had left their minds restless. Alexander turned on the mattress, uncomfortable, feeling the hardness of the floor beneath his back. He looked at the ceiling, remembering the times when, as a child, he would lie in that same room and listen to the sound of rain hitting the shingles. Back then, his mother was always nearby. Now the distance between them was much greater than the years that separated them. "Are you awake?" whispered Stephen. "I never slept." Stephen sighed and ran a hand over his face. "This is hell." Alexander didn't respond immediately. He couldn't deny that being there, in the house of his childhood, made him feel out of place. Not because the place had changed, but because he no longer belonged to it. "Do you think she'll forgive us?" he finally asked. Stephen took a moment to answer. "I don't know, but I also don't know if we deserve it." Alexander closed his eyes, feeling the weight of guilt sinking into his chest. "We have to try." "Yes, but where do we start?" Before Alexander could respond, they heard a noise in the kitchen. Someone was moving with measured steps. The sound of dishes could be heard in the silent house. They got up and walked cautiously toward the living room. Maggie was there, with her back to them, serving coffee in an old ceramic teapot. For a moment, neither dared to speak. She looked so fragile, so small in that big, empty house. Alexander cleared his throat softly. "Good morning, Mom." Maggie turned with the same calm as the day before. Her gaze showed no surprise or anger, only a deep tiredness, as if her children's presence reminded her of a story she preferred not to relive. "Sit down," she said without emotion. They obeyed. The old woman served coffee in 3 uneven cups and sat across from them. She said nothing more. The silence between them was heavy, uncomfortable. Alexander looked at the coffee cup in front of him, but didn't take a single sip. "We'll stay for a while," he finally said, breaking the tension. Maggie slowly raised her eyes. "What for?" Stephen shifted in his seat. "We want to help you." The old woman let out a slight laugh, but there was no joy in it. 20 years too late. Alexander felt a knot in his throat. "We know we abandoned you, but—" Maggie raised a hand, stopping him. "I don't need you to tell me that. I lived it." The words were like a slap. Alexander felt his chest burn, but he knew he had no right to justify himself. Stephen looked away, ashamed. "We want to fix things, Mom." Maggie sighed and took a sip of coffee. "You say you want to help me, but I wonder, is it really for me? Or for yourselves?" Alexander frowned. "What do you mean? Are you coming to help me? Or are you coming to alleviate your guilt?" The silence that followed was sepulchral. Alexander didn't have an answer that wouldn't sound selfish. "I don't know what to tell you," he admitted. Maggie put the cup on the table with a slight tap. "Then don't say anything." She rose from the table and went out to the backyard, leaving her children in the kitchen, facing an impossible void to fill. Alexander rested his elbows on the table and rubbed his face with both hands. "I don't know how to do this, Stephen." His brother exhaled heavily. Neither do I. The sound of the front door opening startled them. Matt entered with a bag of bread and a serious expression on his face. How did the repentant children sleep? Alexander closed his eyes with frustration. Are you always this annoying? Matt smiled. Only when there are people who deserve it. Stephen snorted. Look, we don't have to get along. No, we don't have to, admitted Matt, walking to the table. But don't expect me to make things easy for you, either. He left the bag of bread on the table and looked at them fixedly. If you really want to help, Mrs. Sullivan, you'll have to prove it with actions, not pretty words. Alexander crossed his arms. And how are we supposed to do that? Matt leaned slightly over the table and smiled mockingly. Starting by fixing this house. Alexander frowned. What Matt pointed to the ceiling. If you really plan to stay, you can't let your mother continue living in a place that's falling apart. Stephen looked around, and for the first time since they arrived, really noticed how deteriorated the house was. Walls with deep cracks. A roof with leaks. Broken windows that barely held up. Alexander sighed and ran a hand through his hair. All right, where do we start? Matt smiled wryly. Looks like you're finally understanding. Maggie, from the backyard, observed them through the window. Her expression was still serious. But deep down, there was something she didn't want to admit out loud. A small spark of hope. Alexander and Stephen got to work at dawn. There were no more uncomfortable conversations with their mother. No inquisitive looks from Matt. The house spoke for itself. The walls needed reinforcements. The roof had holes where rain and wind snuck in without permission. The windows were opaque with so much dust, and the wood of the doors creaked like a lament of time. Matt, with his usual defiant attitude, crossed his arms while watching the two brothers standing in the middle of the yard, observing the house as if it were a battlefield. I hope you know what you're doing, he said in a mocking tone. Alexander glared at him. It's not that complicated. It's just a matter of fixing what's broken. Matt burst out laughing. Just like your relationship with your mother? Stephen rolled his eyes. Annoyed. You always have something to say. Only when it's necessary. Alexander ignored the provocation and approached the worn structure of the house. He ran his hand over the adobe wall, feeling how the material crumbled at his touch. We need cement to reinforce this, and someone who knows about construction. Matt nodded. I know a man in town who could help us. His name is Joe Carter. How much does he charge, I don't know, but I can ask him. Alexander and Stephen exchanged glances. They couldn't afford to reject help. Tell him we need him as soon as possible, said Stephen. Matt shrugged. Fine, but I warn you about something. If you start this, finish it. Alexander frowned. We're not cowards. Matt held his gaze firmly. That remains to be seen. Without saying more, he walked away down the dusty street to look for the builder. Alexander clenched his fists, but Stephen patted him on the shoulder. Let it go. He's protecting our mother. Alexander sighed. I know, but I can't stand his attitude. It's because he sees us as strangers. And in a way, we are. Alexander didn't respond. Deep down, he knew Stephen was right. Mid-morning, Joe Carter arrived with a straw hat and a sack of tools over his shoulder. A thin man with skin tanned by the sun, with rough hands from years of work. He looked at the house with a critical eye before speaking. This needs a lot of work, but if you're willing, we can fix it. Alexander nodded. Tell us what to do. They spent hours removing debris, mixing cement, and reinforcing the walls. The hands of Alexander and Stephen, accustomed to keyboards and documents, were covered in dust and blisters. Each brick placed, each nail hammered, was a small penance for the lost years. In the distance, Maggie observed from the shade of the corridor, arms crossed and with an illegible expression. Matt approached her and offered her a cup of coffee. "You're not going to say anything, are you?" The old woman took the cup and took a sip before answering. "Not yet." Matt smiled wryly. "So you're testing them?" Maggie let out a sigh. "I'm waiting to see if this time they stay." Matt looked at the brothers sweating under the sun, neither complaining nor stopping. "And what do you think?" The old woman narrowed her eyes, as if looking for something in the dust raised by the work. "I still don't know." But in her heart, a small spark of hope was beginning to ignite. The hands of Alexander and Stephen ached after hours of work. They weren't used to physical labor, but they didn't complain. Each brick they placed was an attempt to rebuild, not just the house, but something much more fragile. Their mother's trust. Joe Carter, the town's builder, supervised the work with a critical eye, giving them orders in a firm voice. "More mix in this part. We don't want it to fall with the first rain." Alexander wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "Yes, Mr. Carter." Stephen, who had just finished hammering one of the roof boards, dropped the hammer and sighed. "I hope Mom is seeing this," he murmured. Matt, who was leaning on the door with his arms crossed, smiled mockingly. "You expect her to forgive you with this?" Stephen looked at him tiredly. "No, Matt, but we have to start somewhere." Matt let out a slight snort. "Well, work faster. The house won't fix itself." Alexander felt the urge to respond with sarcasm, but he restrained himself. He had to show with actions that they weren't there out of simple repentance. The sound of wood creaking made everyone look up. Maggie was in the corridor, observing them with a neutral expression. "And what do you plan to do with the back door?" she suddenly asked. Alexander took a moment to respond. "What's wrong with the back door?" The old woman leaned on the frame and pointed with her head. "It swells with moisture." "It needs to be changed before the next rain." Alexander nodded. "We'll take care of that." Maggie said nothing more. She remained there for a moment with her arms crossed, observing the work. Matt approached her and offered her a cup of coffee. "They're making an effort," he commented in a low voice. The old woman took the cup but didn't drink. "We'll see how long it lasts for them." Matt smiled wryly. "You're tougher than I thought." Maggie narrowed her eyes. "They taught me to be—" Matt looked at Alexander and Stephen, who continued working without complaining. And if this time it's different, the old woman didn't respond. Inside, she wanted to believe it, but the fear of being abandoned again weighed more than hope. When night fell, the brothers entered the house with tired arms and hands covered in dust. Maggie had already set the table with simple plates and a pot of hot beans. No one said anything when they sat down to dinner. There was no need. But in the middle of the silence, Alexander looked up and met his mother's eyes. "Thank you for dinner." Maggie didn't respond immediately. Then, without looking at him, she murmured, "I still don't know if you deserve it." The air in the room tensed. But Alexander, instead of getting angry, simply nodded. "Then we'll keep trying." Maggie said nothing more. But inside, a crack in her wall of indifference began to open. The sky over Millfield dawned cloudy. A cool breeze swept through the dirt streets, raising the scent of rain that had fallen during the early morning. Inside the house, the sound of hammers and saws broke the morning silence. Alexander and Stephen, with their shirts soaked in sweat, worked on repairing the back door, the one their mother had pointed out to them the day before. Matt, as usual, observed them from a distance. He didn't give them instructions or intervene, but he didn't leave either. He was like a silent guardian, making sure they fulfilled what they had promised. "The wood is rotten," said Stephen, lifting one of the old boards. "If we keep hammering on this, the door won't last a month." Alexander frowned, evaluating the structure. "We need new wood. I can get it in town." Matt finally intervened. "Approaching." Alexander looked at him with suspicion. "You'll do us a favor." Matt smiled with irony. "I'm not doing you a favor. If you're going to stay, at least make sure the house doesn't fall on top of your mother." Stephen rolled his eyes. "Whatever. Matt, just bring it." Matt turned without saying more and walked away down the dirt road, disappearing into the dust raised by his steps. Alexander leaned against the doorframe and wiped his forehead with his sleeve. "Have you noticed something, Stephen?" who was trying to remove rusty nails from the old wood, grunted. "What Matt doesn't want us here. But he hasn't asked us to leave either." Stephen stopped hammering and became thoughtful. "Maybe he just wants to make sure we don't hurt her again." Alexander sighed. "What worries me most is that I think he's right to do it." The brothers remained silent. The problem wasn't Matt. It was the past they carried on their shoulders. When Matt returned with the wood, the afternoon was already falling. Alexander and Stephen hurried to place the new boards, hammering with precision until the new door stood firmly in its place. When they finished, they stepped back to admire their work. "It didn't turn out so bad," said Stephen, cleaning his hands on his pants. "No, not bad at all," admitted Alexander. Matt crossed his arms. "You did what you promised. That's already progress." The compliment disguised as criticism didn't go unnoticed. Alexander looked at him suspiciously. "Are you starting to tolerate us? Let's not exaggerate." Matt laughed softly. For the first time since they arrived, Matt didn't sound like an enemy. When they entered the house, they found Maggie in the kitchen, stirring a broth in the old clay pot she had used all her life. "The door is ready," announced Alexander. The old woman didn't look up. "Good." Silence stretched between them. Alexander and Stephen expected something more, some word of approval, however minimal. But Maggie only served a plate and put it in front of Matt. "Eat before it gets cold." The gesture was subtle but clear. Matt had earned his place in that house. They, on the other hand, were still on trial. Alexander and Stephen looked at each other, feeling the weight of reality. Their mother hadn't forgiven them, at least not yet. But what none of them knew was that while they were trying to rebuild the present, the past was about to return to put them to the test. The afternoon wind blew strongly over Millfield. It was as if the entire town held its breath, waiting for something that was about to happen. Inside the house, Alexander and Stephen had finished cleaning the remains of old wood from the back door. Their hands were covered in dust. Their muscles ached from the effort. But there was a strange feeling in the air, as if they were still out of place. Maggie was in the living room, seated in her old rocking chair, knitting slowly. Her bony, firm hands worked with precision, as if she didn't care about the noise of hammering or the weight of the two sons who, after so many years, were trying to repair what they once destroyed. Matt, as usual, watched them in silence. There was something in his posture that put them on alert, as if he knew something they ignored. Today, at the store, I heard something, he finally said. Alexander looked up. And what did you hear? Matt crossed his arms. That another one of your siblings is coming. The air in the room seemed to become denser. Stephen frowned. Who? Matt shrugged. They didn't say the name, but I bet it's Lucy. Alexander felt a chill down his spine. Lucy, the only daughter of Maggie Sullivan, the one who disappeared after getting married, the one who never returned, not even for a funeral, the one who didn't send letters, the one who didn't pick up the phone in 20 years. How are you so sure? Asked Alexander. Matt leaned against the wall and looked at him with a mocking smile. Because someone like Lucy wouldn't bear for you to be the only ones repairing your image. Stephen cursed under his breath. This is the last thing we need right now. Maggie said nothing. She continued knitting as if the conversation didn't exist, but Alexander saw how her hand trembled, just for an instant, before resuming the rhythm. Mom, he said in a low voice. The old woman didn't look up. I knew that sooner or later she would come. Alexander exchanged a quick glance with Stephen. And what do you think about it? Maggie stopped. She put the knitting on her lap, sighed, and stood up. Wait for her. That was all she said before walking to her room. Matt smiled ironically and shook his head. This is going to get interesting. Alexander didn't respond. He remained looking at the door where his mother had disappeared, with a nagging thought stuck in his mind. If Lucy was really coming, it was because she wanted something. And whatever it wasn't going to be good. The morning heat was already present when a strange sound interrupted the usual tranquility of Millfield. A powerful, rough engine, foreign to the dusty streets of the town, was approaching Maggie's house. Alexander and Stephen were in the back of the house, finishing reinforcing one of the windows when they heard the noise of the vehicle. Both exchanged a quick glance, their bodies tense with an uncomfortable premonition. They knew who it was before they even saw her. Matt, who was leaning on the kitchen door, calmly sharpening a knife, also turned toward the entrance. His expression showed no surprise, but rather a clear curiosity. The car, a black sedan with tinted windows, stopped right in front of the house. It wasn't just any car. Shiny, with elegant lines and spotless tires that seemed to have never touched a dirt road in their life. The doors of the vehicle remained closed for a few seconds, as if its occupant was taking a moment before exiting. Then, with almost calculated precision, the driver's door opened. And there she was, Lucy. It had been more than 20 years, but she seemed not to have allowed time to catch up with her. She wore a perfectly fitted pantsuit with high heels that didn't belong on that uneven ground. Her black hair was pulled back in an impeccable bun, and dark glasses covered her eyes. Lucy took off her glasses slowly, revealing a calculating, sharp gaze, like the edge of a freshly sharpened knife. The neighbors, who were always attentive to movements at Maggie's house, began to discreetly stop to observe from afar. Lucy wasn't just anyone in that town. Everyone remembered her. Everyone knew she had left without looking back. And everyone knew that unlike Alexander and Stephen, she had never shown intentions of returning. Matt leaned on the doorframe, crossing his arms over his chest. He said nothing, but his posture said it all. He was measuring Lucy, evaluating what had just entered his territory. Alexander and Stephen walked toward the entrance just as Lucy was beginning to climb the steps of the house. Lucy murmured, "Alexander," his voice full of disbelief. His sister stopped for barely a second, then lowered her glasses down the bridge of her nose and looked at them with a half-smile. "Alexander, Stephen." There was something in her tone, in the way she pronounced their names, that sent chills down their spines. "I thought you would be the last ones to return." She continued with an unsettling calm. "But I see I was wrong." Stephen frowned, his patience quickly running out. "Why did you come?" Lucy didn't avert her gaze, but she didn't respond immediately either. Instead, she turned her face with elegance and directed her attention to the half-open door, where Maggie's figure was barely visible in the dim light of the house. "To see Mom." "Of course," she finally said, her voice perfectly measured. Alexander felt the weight of those words like a blow to the stomach, not because they sounded sincere, but because they knew they came with a hidden purpose. The silence that followed was dense, heavy. The warm morning breeze stirred the dust on the road, but no one moved. It was Maggie who finally broke the stillness. "Come in." Her voice was low but clear. There was no sweetness or reproach, just an acknowledgement of the inevitable. Lucy smiled slightly, climbed the last step, and crossed the door without hesitation. Alexander and Stephen remained at the threshold, still stunned by the sudden presence of their sister. Matt looked at them with an expression that oscillated between amusement and challenge. "What's wrong? Weren't you going to receive her with hugs and tears?" Stephen clenched his jaw. "It's not that." "Then what is it?" Alexander took a deep breath, trying to order his thoughts. He hadn't seen Lucy in more than 2 decades. They didn't even have her number. They didn't know where she lived, what had become of her. And now she suddenly appeared with her gleaming car, with her perfect clothes, with that attitude she had always had of being above others. And, worst of all, he didn't believe for a second that she was there just to see her mother. Matt smiled wryly, enjoying the discomfort on the faces of the 2 brothers. "This is going to be interesting," he said with sarcasm. Alexander shot him a withering look but didn't respond, because deep down, he was right. Lucy hadn't come just out of nostalgia or repentance. She had come because she wanted something, and Alexander was sure that discovering what it was wasn't going to please him. Lucy crossed the door with the same confidence with which she had left that house more than 20 years ago. She didn't hesitate. She didn't look around with nostalgia or vacillation. She entered as if that home had never left her behind, as if time hadn't made a dent in her relationship with her mother. Maggie, seated in her old rocking chair, observed her only daughter without flinching. There was no emotion on her face, no joy, no anger, just a deep silence, like that of a storm that hasn't yet arrived. Alexander and Stephen followed her with their gaze without moving from the entrance. They didn't know if they should enter or stay outside. Lucy's presence made everything in the house seem smaller, more fragile. Matt, who was still leaning against the wall, watched the scene with his arms crossed. He didn't interrupt, but he didn't look away either. Lucy took off her sunglasses and left her purse on the table with a measured, elegant movement. She remained standing with her back straight, looking at her mother with a slight smile that seemed rehearsed. "Mom," she finally said, as if that word didn't weigh on her lips. Maggie didn't respond immediately. She just rocked slightly in her chair before speaking. "You're late?" The air in the room seemed to become denser, Alexander saw the slight tension in his sister's face, the quick blink of her eyes before her smile reaffirmed itself. "But I came," she responded calmly. Stephen crossed his arms. "And what made you decide to return after so long?" Lucy turned to him with an expression of slight surprise. "Oh, Stephen, still so direct, and you still avoiding questions." Lucy let out a slight laugh, but there was no joy in it. "I came because I want to see Mom," she said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Matt laughed under his breath, shaking his head. "And you really expect us to believe that Lucy looked at him for the first time, examining him with curiosity? It was evident she hadn't expected to find him there." "You must be Matt," she said softly, as if testing the name on her tongue. "I've heard about you." Matt wasn't fazed. "I hope what you've heard is good." Lucy tilted her head slightly. "It depends on who I ask." Stephen clicked his tongue, tired of the game. "Lucy, tell me the truth. Why are you here?" Lucy sighed and sat in one of the chairs with her back perfectly straight. "If I must be honest, I'm here because I saw the photo." Alexander felt his jaw tense. "The photo?" "Yes," nodded Lucy, looking at him directly, "the one they posted online. Mom sitting at the entrance of the house as if waiting for the return of her prodigal children." Her tone was soft, but her words were sharp. "It seemed concerning," she added. Matt laughed under his breath. "Concerning?" he repeated with sarcasm. "Wow, what a convenient word." Lucy narrowed her eyes, but her expression didn't change. "If I had found out earlier, perhaps I would have come earlier." Alexander stepped forward. "Do you really expect us to believe you?" Lucy looked at him with feigned surprise. "Do you have reasons not to?" Alexander felt anger rising in his throat. Yes, 20 years of silence. The silence in the house became suffocating. Maggie left her knitting in her lap and sighed. "Lucy, would you like something to eat?" Everyone turned to look at her. Lucy smiled, leaning slightly forward. "If you offer." "Mom." "Of course I would." Alexander clenched his fists. His mother wasn't surprised by Lucy's arrival. It was as if she had been waiting for this moment. Matt observed the scene with interest, measuring the reactions of each one. When Maggie rose slowly to go to the kitchen, Matt turned to Lucy with narrowed eyes. "Tell me something," he said in a low voice, just loud enough for only her to hear. "What do you really want?" Lucy held his gaze without blinking and smiled. "You'll find out soon." And Matt knew in that instant that the real storm was just about to begin. The day passed in a tense calm inside Maggie's house. Lucy's presence had changed everything. Her arrival had not only reopened old wounds, but had introduced a new uncertainty to the family. Because now, what was she really looking for? The afternoon slowly fell over Millfield. The sky had a reddish hue, and the air became heavier, as if the entire town were waiting for something important to happen. Inside the house, Maggie maintained her silence, with the same rigid posture as always. Her children were there, but that didn't mean the distance between them had disappeared. 20 years of abandonment were not erased in one day. Lucy, who had spent much of the time observing every corner of the house, finally spoke. "This place hasn't changed much." Stephen stopped stirring the spoon in his coffee cup and looked at her with a furrowed brow. "That's because you were never here to help change it." Lucy smiled at him calmly. I see you haven't lost your bitterness. Stephen, Matt, who was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, let out a low laugh. If anyone has the right to be bitter here, it's those two. Lucy glanced at him out of the corner of her eye. Well, I see we also have a guardian here. Matt didn't deny the accusation. Someone had to do it. The air in the room became heavier. The conversation wasn't leading to any reconciliation, only to more confrontations. Alexander decided to intervene before everything got out of hand. Lucy, you said you saw the photo of Mom. Why did you really come back? Lucy put her cup on the table slowly. Because she's my mother. That doesn't answer the question. Lucy smiled slightly and looked at him directly. You're right. It doesn't answer the question. The tension could be cut with a knife. Before anyone could continue speaking, a knock at the front door interrupted the moment. The sound resonated loudly in the house, as if someone were knocking with urgency. Everyone remained silent. No one was expecting visitors. Matt was the first to move. He turned cautiously and walked to the door without taking his eyes off the siblings. He observed them as if expecting one of them to react before he did himself. Another knock, stronger this time. Maggie rose slowly from her chair. Open it, Matt. He looked at her for a second before nodding. He turned the knob and pushed the door. An older man with graying hair and a face hardened by the years stood at the entrance. His dark eyes scanned the house with the quickness of someone who knew that place. Lucy, Alexander, and Stephen were paralyzed. They knew who he was. Matt, who didn't recognize the man, frowned. Who are you? The man ignored him, his gaze fixed on Maggie. It's been a long time. Maggie showed no surprise. Her eyes didn't reflect fear or joy, only resignation. Yes. Emile. It has been... Alexander felt a chill run down his spine. That name. Emile Winters. The man his mother never talked about. The man who had somehow always been a shadow in the family's history. And now he was there, in front of them, waiting. And his arrival would change everything. The air in Maggie's house became thick, charged with a tension that seemed to expand into every corner. Emile Winters remained at the entrance without moving, his gaze fixed on the woman he once loved. He had waited a long time to see her again, but now that he was in front of her, the words seemed to have escaped him. Maggie, on the other hand, didn't seem surprised. Her face showed no emotion at all, neither joy nor anger, just a deep resignation. Alexander felt a chill run down his spine. He had never heard his mother mention this man. But somehow, his name had always floated in the house like a ghost. Stephen crossed his arms and looked at Emile with mistrust. Who are you? And what do you want Lucy? Who until that moment had remained silent, raised an eyebrow with interest. Her expression showed no surprise, but curiosity. Emile Winters, she murmured, testing the name on her lips. So you finally decided to appear. Matt, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, looked Emile up and down cautiously. He didn't trust him, but he didn't intervene either. He knew that this conversation didn't belong to him. Emile finally broke the silence. His voice was deep, marked by the years and by a life that hadn't been easy. I don't come to cause problems. I just want to talk with Margaret. Alexander felt his mother tense up, just for a second, before responding. It's been more than 40 years. Emile, what do you want to talk about now? The man pressed his lips together, as if looking for the right words. Because I don't want to keep silence any longer. A heavy silence fell over everyone. Matt straightened up. Alexander and Stephen exchanged looks of confusion. And Lucy, who had been leaning on the table with an indifferent expression, finally showed interest. "This is getting interesting," she murmured. Maggie took a deep breath and looked at Emile with the same hardness as always. "If you wanted to talk, you should have done it a long time ago." Emile lowered his gaze, as if guilt hit him with all its force. "I know, but I don't want to leave without you knowing the truth." Alexander stepped forward, feeling a knot in his stomach. What truth? Emile looked at him, and on his face there was something Alexander couldn't immediately identify. It was a silent recognition, a weight he carried in his gaze. "You and your siblings have the right to know what happened." Matt observed the scene with attention. He wasn't part of the family, but he had spent enough time in the house to know that this would change everything. Maggie rubbed her temples with her hands. She looked tired, as if the weight of the years and the secrets she kept were crushing her. "If you really want to talk, come in." Emile nodded slowly and crossed the door. The siblings remained still for a moment, as if the threshold of the house had become a dividing line between the past and the present. Then, one by one, they entered behind him. Matt was the last to cross the door, closing it behind him with a slight click, and with that sound, everyone knew the truth was about to come to light. The sound of the door closing behind Emile Winters was like an echo of the past, resonating in the walls of that house. For years, his name had been a ghost, a whisper that was never spoken aloud. And now he was there, in flesh and blood, breathing the same air charged with history and silence. Maggie remained in her place, firm, with her hands crossed on her lap. She showed no surprise, no anger, not even nostalgia. She simply observed the man who more than 40 years ago had disappeared without a trace. Alexander and Stephen, standing by the table, watched the scene without fully understanding its meaning. They had never heard of Emile Winters, and yet they could feel the weight of his presence in the room. Lucy, with her usual impenetrable expression, studied the newcomer with the same interest with which one examines a forgotten museum piece. Matt, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, observed with a mixture of curiosity and mistrust. It wasn't his family, but he had spent enough time with Maggie to know that this wasn't a simple visit from the past. Emile took a deep breath, as if gathering the courage to speak. His face, marked by the years, showed a guilt that seemed to have carried for too long. "Margaret?" His voice, though firm, had a subtle tremor, as if in pronouncing her name. Something inside him broke. "I don't know where to start," he continued. Maggie slightly tilted her head. "You could start by explaining why you came back." Alexander frowned and looked at his mother. "You knew who he was." She didn't look away from Emile. "I always knew." The tension in the room grew. Stephen crossed his arms, feeling that something much bigger was about to come to light. Lucy smiled slightly, but not mockingly, rather with a strange interest. "So, you finally arrived. Emile, took you long enough?" The man clenched his jaw but nodded. "I know." Matt, who had remained silent, intervened for the first time. And why now? Emile ran a hand through his graying hair and exhaled tiredly. "Because I can't keep quiet any longer." Maggie rose slowly from her chair and walked to the window. You left without looking back. Emile. What makes you think your return will change anything? The man lowered his gaze. I don't know, but I need to tell the truth. Alexander stepped forward with his chest tight with uncertainty. What truth? Emile raised his head and looked him directly in the eyes. The truth about your father. The silence that followed was brutal. Alexander felt the room moving around him. No, he couldn't mean what he was thinking. What are you saying? Stephen asked in a tense voice. Emile swallowed and looked at Maggie with a silent plea in his eyes. Margaret, please, I don't want to be the one to say it. Maggie closed her eyes for a second before turning to her children. It's time for you to know the truth. Lucy crossed her arms and leaned her back against the wall, waiting calmly. She already knew. Alexander, on the other hand, felt the ground opening beneath his feet. Maggie took air and spoke with a voice that seemed to drag decades of pain. Emile is not just an old friend of the family. All eyes in the room fixed on her. He is the real father of one of you. Alexander felt the air leaving him. Their lives, their memories, their history were about to change forever. The air inside Maggie's house felt heavy, as if each word spoken carried decades of buried history. Emile Winter's revelation had fallen on the family like lightning in a storm. Alexander felt his throat dry. His mind struggled to make sense of what he had just heard. One of them wasn't the son of the man they had called father all their life. Stephen, standing by the table, had his fists clenched. His jaw was tense, as if he were containing a violent response. Lucy, on the other hand, showed no surprise. It was evident that she already knew the truth, or at least suspected it. She crossed her arms and looked at her mother with an impenetrable expression. Are you going to say it? Or are you going to make us guess Maggie didn't immediately react? Her back remained straight in the chair, her tired eyes fixed on Emile. She didn't seem like a defeated woman, but one who had faced that truth inside her long before this moment arrived. Matt, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, observed attentively. He wasn't part of that family, but he had spent enough time in the house to know that this would change everything. Alexander swallowed and finally found his voice. Which one of us? The question hung in the air for a few seconds that seemed eternal. Maggie closed her eyes briefly, as if in her mind she traveled to a distant time. When she spoke, her voice didn't tremble. Alexander. The world seemed to stop. Alexander felt his chest tighten, that the air in the room became too dense to breathe. No, he whispered, as if denying it out loud could change reality. Stephen looked at his brother with a hardened face, not with anger, but with confusion. Alexander, he repeated, as if the name no longer made sense. Lucy let out a slight sigh, shaking her head with a laugh that contained no joy. I knew it. Alexander took a step back, shaking his head. No, it can't be. His mind filled with memories of his childhood, of his father teaching him to ride a horse, of the stories he told him before sleeping, of the last time he saw him alive. He was my father, he said with a broken voice. You can't tell me now that... His mother raised her hand, stopping him. He raised you as his son, but he wasn't. Alexander felt a void opening under his feet. Number. Stephen ran a hand through his hair, exhaling with frustration. And why did you never tell us Maggie kept her gaze firm? Because at that moment, it didn't make sense. And later, when I wanted to, it was too late. Emil finally spoke. I didn't want to complicate things more either. Alexander turned abruptly toward him. You had no right to decide that for me. His voice resonated strongly in the room. The anger, betrayal, confusion consumed him. Emil nodded, accepting the rage without defending himself. I know. Lucy, who had remained silent, looked at her mother with interest. And did Dad know Maggie looked down? He always knew. The silence that followed was overwhelming, a silence that contained more truths than words could explain. Matt, who until that moment had observed without intervening, finally spoke. Well, that explains a lot of things. Alexander ran his hands over his face, feeling that everything he believed he knew about himself was crumbling. Lucy observed him with something akin to pity. You have the same gaze as Emil. Alexander clenched his jaw. Shut up, Lucy. Matt let out a slight laugh, not mockingly, but with the awareness that the Sullivan family was even more broken than he had thought. And now what? Asked Stephen, his voice more calm but still charged with tension. Alexander looked at his mother with his heart tied in a knot. How did you expect me to react? Maggie didn't look away. I don't know, but I want you to know that you were never less to your father. That hurt even more. Alexander took a deep breath, trying to find stability in a reality that was crumbling around him. I need to get out of here. Without waiting for a response, he left the house and left behind the suffocating air of secrets. Matt followed him with his gaze, then looked at Emil. Well, yes, you all are a mess. Maggie closed her eyes because she knew that was just the beginning of the storm. Alexander felt the heavy air as he left the house. The weight of the truth still crushed him. His father wasn't his father. His entire life had been a lie woven with threads of silence and secrets. He walked without direction, moving away from the small corridor where he grew up, away from the house that now felt more foreign than ever. The voices inside his head fought with each other, reminding him of every moment he spent believing he was someone he wasn't. The sun was slowly descending behind the distant hills, tinting the sky an intense orange. But inside Maggie's house, the light seemed dimmed. The battle between the siblings had reached a critical point, and now everyone knew that the calm was only temporary. Lucy had shut herself in her room since the morning without addressing anyone else. It wasn't a retreat, but a strategy. Matt knew it. He had seen many people like her in his life, people who never showed their cards until the last second. Alexander and Stephen were in the backyard with their nerves tense. We can't keep waiting to see what Mom does, said Stephen, running a hand through his hair. This needs to be resolved now. Alexander gritted his teeth. And what do you want us to do? Force the truth out of her? Matt leaned in the doorway, with his carefree expression, but with his eyes loaded with intention. You don't need to do that, because I think the truth is about to come out on its own. The two brothers looked at him with furrowed brows. What do you mean? Asked Alexander. Matt tilted his head toward the living room. Look who just arrived. Maggie was seated in her armchair with her hands resting on the wooden arms, as if she were holding something much heavier than her own body. Lucy was standing in front of her with an expression of absolute calm, but with fiery eyes. It's time for you to tell the truth. Mom, Lucy said in a soft but firm voice. Alexander and Stephen entered the living room in silence. Matt followed them, leaning on the doorframe. He wouldn't intervene unless necessary. Maggie raised her gaze slowly. She didn't seem surprised, not even concerned. "You are always impatient. Lucy." Lucy sketched a smile. "And you always knew more than you told us." Alexander felt a chill down his spine. His mother was calm. Too calm. "Mom," he began to say, but she raised a hand to stop him. "I'm going to speak, but I want you to understand something. This isn't a negotiation." Lucy narrowed her eyes but said nothing. Maggie took a breath and straightened her back. "I've made a decision about the house." Alexander and Stephen held their breath. Matt crossed his arms. Lucy smiled. "We already knew that. The question is, who are you going to leave it to?" Maggie looked at her with an expression no one could decipher. "The house won't be sold." Lucy rolled her eyes. "You've said that before, but that doesn't answer the question." Maggie remained silent for a moment. When she finally spoke, her words were like a knife cutting the air. "The house won't be for any of you." The silence was absolute. Alexander frowned. What Lucy blinked, as if for the first time in a long time. She hadn't anticipated something. Stephen took a step forward. "Mom, what do you mean by that?" Maggie looked at each of her children. "This house will be for who was really here when I needed it." Matt felt the air in the room growing heavier. Lucy narrowed her eyes and let out a sarcastic laugh. "You can't be serious." Maggie didn't respond. Alexander felt the world collapsing under his feet. "Mom, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that the house will be for Matt." The declaration fell on them like thunder. Lucy opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Stephen seemed to have lost the ability to speak. Matt, for the first time in a long time, was left speechless. Why, Alexander finally asked, his voice barely audible. Maggie's eyes were clear and determined. For years, this house was empty. You all left me with nothing but silence and loneliness. Matt was the only one who came every day, who fixed what was broken, who made sure I ate. He gave me back my dignity when my own blood had forgotten me. This house has been more his than yours for years now. Matt shook his head. "Mrs. Sullivan, I didn't do any of that to get something in return." "I know," she replied with a gentle smile. "That's exactly why you deserve it." Alexander felt his heart beating strongly in his ears. No, you can't do that." Maggie looked at him with the same calm as always. "I can, and I did." Lucy recovered her speech with a snort. "This is a joke." "It isn't." "Lucy," she looked at her mother with incredulity. "You can't give the house to a stranger." Maggie narrowed her eyes. "Matt has been here longer than any of you." "But he's not family." Maggie looked at her with hardness. "Family isn't just blood." Alexander felt his chest hurt. "Mom, are you really going to leave us with nothing?" Maggie looked at him with sadness. "I'm not leaving you without anything. Alexander, you made that decision when you left me alone." Matt finally found his voice. "I didn't ask for this." Maggie nodded. "I know. But it's yours. Lucy was trembling with rage. This won't stay like this. Maggie got up with effort and walked toward her room. I don't have time to argue. What's done is done. Lucy looked at her disappear down the hallway with clenched fists. Matt looked at Alexander and Stephen. In his eyes, there was confusion, pain, and something that seemed to be resignation. And at that moment, Matt knew that nothing would be the same again. The air in Maggie's house had grown dense, almost unbreathable after the revelation about the inheritance. The silence at the table felt like the edge of a knife grazing the skin. Alexander couldn't believe it. His mother had decided to leave the house to Matt, a young man who, although he had been with her in her last years, didn't have her blood, didn't share her history. Stephen was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and his jaw clenched. He wasn't a violent man, but the frustration was consuming him. Lucy, on the other hand, maintained complete control. She didn't shout. She didn't hit the table. She didn't react with the indignation of someone who had just lost what she believed was hers. She just smiled. So it's official, she finally said with a chilling calm. Mom leaves us with nothing. Maggie didn't hesitate. Those who left me with nothing were you. The response was a direct hit. Alexander felt the weight of those words sink into his chest. Matt, who had remained quiet, finally spoke. I didn't ask for this. Lucy looked at him with her head tilted, as if she were studying him. You didn't have to ask for it. You got it the best way, with patience. Matt held her gaze without blinking, or maybe because I was the only one here. The silence in the room grew heavier. There was no argument against that. Lucy sighed and got up slowly. She wasn't in a hurry. She had no visible anger, but her calm only made the tension grow. I suppose this isn't over, she said with a crooked smile. Alexander stood up suddenly, with his eyes full of rage. You can't do anything. Mom already decided. Lucy looked at him with patience, as if Alexander were a child who didn't understand how the world worked. There's always something that can be done. Matt also stood up, with a warning expression. Don't try anything, Lucy. She smiled at him. Who said I would try? Maybe I already did. And with those words, she went out the door, leaving an echo of uncertainty behind her. Alexander felt a chill run down his spine. I don't like this. Matt ran a hand through his hair and exhaled. Neither do I. Maggie, who was still in her chair, closed her eyes for a moment before speaking. The real battle hasn't started. Alexander looked at her with concern. Mom, what do you think she'll do? Maggie opened her eyes slowly and looked at him with a certainty that left him frozen. Whatever it takes, and Alexander knew in that instant that she wouldn't leave without a fight. Maggie's house sank into a thick silence after her declaration. She had spoken with a clarity that left no room for doubt. Matt would inherit the house, but the words didn't vanish into the air. They stayed floating like a threat, like a sentence. Lucy was standing still, motionless, with her lips slightly parted. For the first time in a long time, she seemed surprised. Her expression wasn't one of defeat, but of disbelief. Matt, she repeated in a whisper, as if by saying it out loud, she could make it sound less absurd. Alexander felt his blood boil. He wasn't angry with Matt, but with his mother's decision. He rose from his chair with clenched fists. Mom, you can't be serious. Maggie looked at him with serenity. I've never been more serious in my life. Stephen ran a hand over his face, as if trying to clear his mind. Mom, Matt isn't even part of the family. Not by blood, Maggie corrected, but by heart. Lucy let out a humorless laugh. This is madness. Matt, who had been silent all that time, finally crossed his arms and looked at the old woman with a furrowed brow. I don't want your house. Maggie nodded slowly. I know. That's why I leave it to you. Lucy snorted with contempt. This won't stand. Matt looked at her coldly. And what are you going to do? Sue your own mother? Lucy glared at him, but didn't respond. Alexander turned to Maggie, his voice lower, but charged with emotion. Mom, please. Maggie held his gaze. I'm not doing this to punish you. Alexander, I'm doing it because it's fair. Alexander felt a knot in his throat. He couldn't argue with that. Lucy took a deep breath and smoothed her blouse with her hands. She recovered her impeccable posture, but her eyes shone with contained fury. Mom, I hope you know what you're doing. Maggie smiled slightly. I always knew. Lucy took her purse and headed for the door. This isn't over. And with those words, she left the house without looking back. Matt ran a hand through his hair and sighed. Well, that was uncomfortable. Alexander dropped into a chair, feeling that the world around him was faltering. Maggie, with her impenetrable calm, took a sip of coffee and looked at Matt. Get ready, son, because the real storm is just beginning. And Matt, though he didn't want to admit it, knew she was right. The air in Maggie's house was charged with something heavier than silence. It was the expectation of a storm that hadn't yet fully broken. The decision had been made, but the battle wasn't over yet. Lucy had disappeared since the afternoon, but no one doubted she was planning her next move. Alexander couldn't sleep. He had spent hours tossing in bed, trying to understand how everything had come to this point. His mother had made it clear that the house would be for Matt, and though part of him understood it, another part couldn't fully accept it. Stephen wasn't sleeping either. From his bed, he looked at the wooden ceiling with his thoughts tangled in anger and frustration. Matt was sitting on the porch with an unlit cigarette between his fingers. He didn't smoke, but in moments of tension, he used to hold it as a way to calm himself. He knew that Lucy wouldn't give up without a fight. She was the type of person who only backed down when there were no more options. In the distance, the sound of a car breaking the silence of the early morning made Matt raise his head. It wasn't just any car. Lucy had returned. He stood up slowly at the same time that Alexander and Stephen came out of the house with tense expressions. None of them said anything, but they all knew what that meant. Lucy's black car stopped in front of the house, and after a few seconds, she got out with the same firm posture as always. She wasn't alone. 2 men accompanied her. They wore dark suits and had the bearing of someone who is accustomed to closing dirty deals. Matt let out a sigh. This is getting interesting. Alexander stepped forward. What did you do? Lucy smiled, but her eyes shone with coldness. I just came to make sure Mom makes the right decision. Stephen crossed his arms. She already made it. Lucy took out her phone and held it in the air. That depends. Matt looked at the screen. It was a formal purchase offer, a figure that made any family fight seem absurd. This is ridiculous, he murmured. Alexander glared at his sister. Do you truly think you can buy Mom? Lucy calmly put the phone away. Not her. But I know who can be bought. Maggie appeared at the door. Her face was serene, but her eyes had the weight of an entire life, observing her children fight over things without value. Lucy. Until when Lucy looked at her with feigned surprise. Until you understand that it's better for everyone. Matt ran a hand through the back of his neck. Leave her alone. Lucy. Lucy looked at him with a sharp smile. Don't get excited. Matt. You still haven't won? Alexander felt a knot in his stomach. Lucy had brought reinforcements, and if there was one thing he knew about her, it was that she never bet without making sure she would win. And then he knew with certainty that the night was just beginning. The night swallowed Millfield with a deceptive calm, but inside Maggie's house, the shadows were still at war. Lucy had disappeared for a few hours after the revelation of the will. She didn't just leave. Everyone knew her calculating mind was plotting her final move. Alexander and Stephen remained in the living room in silence, processing what their mother had decided. It wasn't the inheritance that hurt them, but the reality of having abandoned her for so long. Matt was on the porch with his arms crossed. He knew what was coming wouldn't be easy. He didn't ask for the house, didn't expect it, but now that they had given it to him, he had to defend it. When the front door opened suddenly, everyone raised their heads. Lucy had returned. I didn't come to fight, she said, raising her hands in a gesture of calm. I just want to talk. Maggie, seated in her rocking chair, looked at her patiently. Talk. Then, Lucy advanced a few steps with a firm posture. It was evident that she had carefully thought about her words. I'm not going to accept this, but I'm not going to fight for a house that no longer belongs to me either. Alexander frowned. Are you really going to give up this easily? Lucy held his gaze with a tired smile. It's not giving up. It's accepting what I can't change. Matt, who had remained silent until now, tilted his head suspiciously. That's all. Lucy looked at him for a few seconds before speaking. I just want one last conversation with Mom. Maggie made a gesture with her head. Let's go to the yard. The two women went out, leaving the others in the living room expectantly. No one knew what they said to each other. The conversation was theirs alone. But when they returned, Lucy's eyes were slightly reddened, though her expression remained imperturbable. Without saying more, she took her purse and headed for the door. I'm leaving. Alexander and Stephen exchanged glances, but didn't stop her. Before leaving, Lucy turned her head slightly and looked at Matt. I hope you do something good with this house. Matt observed her with the same intensity as always. I will. Lucy nodded once and left. The silence in the house was different now. It wasn't a void, but a closure. Maggie sighed and looked at her two sons. If you still have something to say to me, this is the moment. Alexander swallowed, his pride hurt by the years of distance. I'm sorry, Mom. Stephen nodded. I am too. Maggie smiled slightly and took their hands. You arrived late, but you arrived. The three of them still sat there, in the house that had witnessed their childhood days and silent partings. No one said anything more, because sometimes silence is the most profound language where old wounds are understood, without needing to be named. Matt stepped out onto the porch. looking up at the deep night sky. He knew that from this moment on, his life would change. Not because all pain had been erased, but because he had chosen to forgive, chosen to return, chosen to love again from a place once forgotten. And in his heart, for the first time in many years, there was a feeling of lightness, peace. That house, which once echoed with laughter and then fell into silence, now once again contained hope. No family is perfect. No past is without blemish. But what gives life meaning is not what we have lost, but how we move forward with what remains and who remains beside us. This story reminds us that love, even when wounded, always has the capacity to heal. That sometimes just one person willing to return, a belated embrace, a sincere forgiveness is enough to begin everything anew. If this story made you pause, think and feel, please write V in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss other emotional stories. Your support is what motivates us to continue telling stories that can touch hearts. See you in the next story. And who knows, it might be another piece of your own life.